back in. Today, we're going to be discussing our week 7 start sit for running back this week. We're going to change things up how we typically do things instead of just doing rankings. We're going to talk about the players that I think have the best matchups that I'm definitely starting, or the players that don't have the best matchups this week that you can consider sitting for this week. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to start with these starts right out the gate. First up is Kenneth Walker going up against the Atlanta Falcons. He is my current RB5 for this week. There was no running back heading into the season that I was higher on entering the season than Kenneth Walker. He has been an absolute home run so far. Through 4 games, he's averaging 15.3 carries per game and a whopping 5.3 targets per game. His 14.6% target share ranks top 5 among all running backs. This isn't just a fueled by opportunities either. He's been rather efficient with his touches as he's ranked second explosive run rate and top 10 in yards after contact per attempt, which has made him a top 5 running back so far this season. This week, the Seahawks head to Atlanta to take on a Falcons defense that has allowed the 15th most rushing yards, but has only yielded 1 touchdown on the ground. Either way, Walker's incredible usage in the passing game has made him an auto start every week and a top 5 running back rest of season. Keep it moving here. Let's talk about Joe Mixon against Green Bay. He is my RB6 this week, but Mixon had another excellent outing this past Sunday, racking up 27.2 PPR points. He did so on 13 carries for 132 yards and 2 touchdowns. This week, the Texans travel to Green Bay to take on the Packers. They have allowed the 13th fewest rushing yards, the 12th fewest touchdowns. However, they have struggled against pass-catching running backs as they've allowed the 8th most receptions and the 4th most receiving yards. I do think Joe Mixon, with his incredible usage, is a really, really good start this week. Next up is J.K. Dobbin against the Cardinals. I have him as my RB12 this week. Dobbins has continued to see his role grow within this offense. He's currently playing 62% of the snaps, seeing 53% of the rush attempts. In the passing game, he's run 42% of the routes, and he's seen about a 10% target share. I would expect him to rise as the season progresses and should see him improve on his 15.8 fantasy points per game, which ranks 14th among all running backs. Chargers head to Arizona this week on Monday Night Football to take on a Cardinals defense that has yielded the 2nd most rushing yards, the 9th most rushing touchdowns, but overall has allowed the 8th most PPR points to the position, making Dobbins a borderline RB1 this week. Next up is Brian Robinson. Now, missed last week with a knee injury. He's been nursing, but it does sound like he should be able to return this week as they get the best matchup against running backs. Robinson has been a consistent source of production as he's been an RB2 or better in every single game he's played this season. While he's only 17th in fantasy points per game, he has had a sizable role, averaging 16 touches per game, and has been efficient with his touches. His ranks 11th in yards after contact per attempt, 8th in evaded tackles, and 16th in explosive run rate. This week, Robinson and the Commanders take on a Panthers defense that has allowed the most rushing yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points. Robinson is an auto start and should be viewed as a top 10 option as long as he's able to return this week. And I also think, just as a bonus, Austin Eckler, I think, is also in play here. Both of these guys have been splitting touches. Eckler's been a little bit more involved in the passing game, but I do think both of these guys in this matchup are incredible starts this week. Keep it moving here, and let's move over to Tony Pollard, who gets the Bills this week. He is my RB15. Pollard has bounced back nicely this season, averaging 15.2 fantasy points per game. The surprising part has been his usage. He's played 66% of the snaps and handled 59% of the rush attempts. Some of this is due to Tyjae Spears being in and out of the lineup with injuries. Spears once again left last weekend's game with an injury, and it looks iffy at best to play. Pollard likely handles a bell cow role against the Bills' defense that has struggled to stop his running backs all year. Bills have allowed the 9th most rushing yards, the 14th fewest touchdowns, but where they really have struggled is in pass-catching running backs, as they've allowed the most receiving yards to running backs this season, which is why they've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs this year. There is a little bit of game script concerns with this one, but either way, I think Pollard will see a healthy dose of targets, making him a viable high-end RB2 this week against the Bills. Keep it moving here. Speaking of running backs that have exceeded expectations, Chuba Hubbard against the Commanders this week. Hubbard continues to be one of the biggest surprises this season, as he is the RB11 overall in fantasy points per game. Since Dalton has taken over, Hubbard has nearly 100 total yards in all 4 games and has scored a touchdown in 3 of those 4. He's also scored no less than 15.3 fantasy points and has finished as a top 8 running back all 4 of those games. Hubbard gets a solid matchup again this week as they face a Commanders defense that has allowed the 13th most fantasy points to running backs. Next up is Kareem Hunt. Now, this is a game where the Chiefs are actually underdogs within this game against the 49ers. Through 2 games, Hunt is averaging 20.5 carries per game, but only a 6.5% target share, which isn't great. His efficiency is something to be desired as he ranks 45th in yards created per touch and it has 0 carries of 10-plus yards. His 4.2 yards per carry also ranks 31st, but overall, as long as he continues to see the goal line work and he can see a bump in the passing game, he will be a viable low end RB2, I think, on most weeks. This week, the Chiefs are traveling to San Francisco to take on a 49ers defense who's been middle of the road against running backs this year. Another thing we'll have to monitor here with this game, CEH looks like he could possibly back the activate him. They opened up his 21-day practice window. So CH could be back in this one, maybe factor in the passing game here. But overall, Kareem Hunt's usage is great, and that's just kind of why I feel okay with starting him this week. I will say though, he does continue to look like a lot like last year's version of Kareem Hunt, where he was really inefficient and not as effective on the ground. So we'll see how this continues. Only been able to start 2 games so far, but that being said, I do still think Kareem Hunt's in play this week. Next up, let's move over to another running back who missed last week, and that was Ramondre Stevenson. But it does sound like he may be able to return for this one. And it couldn't come really at a better time because they faced the Jaguars this week. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride for Stevenson managers this year as he has 3 weeks of RB1 performances, but also has 2 weeks of being brutal and finishes of RB79 and RB37. This sets up as a week, though, he should be a potential RB1 candidate against a Jags defense that has allowed the 7th most fantasy points to running backs. That's it. The Jaguars are a complete mess right now, and it really wouldn't surprise me if the Patriots were able to beat the Jaguars this week. It really feels like Doug Peterson's heading towards be shit canned at this point. So let's keep it moving. Next up in our starts, we have Chase Brown against Cleveland. At the start of the season, Chase Brown is nothing more than a change of pace back, seeing no more than 7 carries in a game. However, the last 3 weeks, we have really seen more of a shift. He's now handling roughly 50% of the rush attempts and is the RB10 overall over those last 3 games. This week, the Bengals are a 6.5-point road favorite against the Browns team that just traded away Amari Cooper. Browns see plenty of work against a Browns defense that has allowed the 5th most rushing touchdowns and the 18th most fantasy points to running back. So I'm not as excited about Zach Moss. I know Zach Moss is still mixing in here with this group, but he just continues to look like Zach Moss, to be frank. Outside of the couple of games he had last year where he looked really good, Zach Moss has never been very efficient and has never been incredible, as a runner. And I just think as the season continues, Chase Brown is going to continue to eat more and more within this backfield. So Chase Brown is a good play this week. Next up is Tank Bigsby. Travis Etienne is considered week to week with a hamstring injury. If that happens, Bigsby would make for a strong RB2 play this week against the Patriots in London. Bigsby would likely handle the early down work, while Dearness Johnson will handle the pass catching duties here. Bigsby has been the most effective running back for the Jaguars on the ground as he's averaging 6.3 yards per carry and his first in explosive run rate and first in yards created per touch. This could be the big breakout game for Tank Bigsby if Etienne were to miss, and game script should be in his favor against a Patriots defense that has allowed the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. So I do think Tank Bigsby's in play. The only thing frustrating with him is he just hasn't been involved in the passing game like at all. He has 1 target all year. Maybe that changes now with Etienne if Etienne were to miss this game. But either way, I still think Tank Bigsby sets up to a really solid start this week because I just can't really see the Patriots, putting up some huge number here and forcing the Jaguars out of a game script where they can run the ball. So, all right. So let's move over to some of my sits. And these aren't necessarily players that I'm just absolutely sitting. Some of these players that you're not going to have a choice, but there's also just some of the stuff I want to talk about here, which is guys that maybe should have lower expectations because of the matchup. And the first one is actually going to be the Lions running backs. While the bulk of production last week came from David Montgomery last week, scoring 21 fantasy points, he actually played less snaps than Jahmyr Gibbs. Monty played 31% of the snaps, handling 33% of the rush attempts. Compared to Gibbs, who actually played 53% of the snaps, but only handled 33% of the rush attempts. However, he did see a healthy 18% target share. You compare that to Monty with only a 3.7% target share for David Montgomery last week. But this is the deal. This week, I expect a much different outcome. The Lions will face a Vikings defense that has been absolutely elite against the run. They have allowed the 4th fewest rushing yards, the fewest touchdowns, and the 2nd fewest fantasy points to running backs. We're obviously not sitting either one of these running backs, but I will say I definitely prefer Jahmyr Gibbs in this matchup just because of his involvement in the passing game. I think this is a matchup that is going to be back and forth, has the potential to be a shootout here, and I definitely think Jahmyr Gibbs makes for the most sense here because of his ability to catch the ball in the backfield. He is much more of the preferred pass catching running back, and I do think that is something that is going to help Jahmyr Gibbs this week. So I still have Jahmyr Gibbs as a back half, of the first. I still have Jahmyr Gibbs as a low end RB1 this week, but I actually have David Montgomery as more of a middling RB2. Hopefully, he can find the end zone to score a touchdown. But I just don't have as high expectations because this is a really bad matchup for any running back for that matter, because the Vikings have just been so good against the run. Next up is Josh Jacobs against Houston Texans. So far this season, Jacobs has largely been ineffective despite handling 65% of the snaps, almost 60% of the rush attempts. but only sees a measly 6% target share. He only has one game this year putting up more than 13 fantasy points in a game and has been wildly inefficient so far, ranking 46th in yards after contact per attempt, 35th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 48th at explosive run rate. Overall is 11.9 fantasy points per game, has him as the RB24 overall. This is why I'm lower, though, on him. The consensus this week is because this matchup against the Texans is also one of the worst you could have. They've allowed the seventh fewest rushing yards, the 10th fewest touchdowns, and the fifth fewest overall fantasy points to running backs. I'm not opposed to sitting him this week, depending on what other options you might have, because this just isn't a great matchup here for Josh Jacobs. And with him not being involved in the passing game, it really hurts his upside. So for me, Josh Jacobs is a very low end RB2. Next up is one of the surprising ones, and that is the 49ers running backs. Jordan Mason has been a pretty solid option this season in the absence of Christian McCaffrey. He does have the second most rushing yards on the ground and has scored 3 touchdowns, but his 15.4 fantasy points per game ranks 17th among all running backs. It should be noted he did leave last Thursday game with a shoulder injury, but he was back at practice today, and it sounds like he should be ready to play this week. But this is the stone cold worst matchup for running backs. The Chiefs have been absolutely elite against running backs. They're allowing just a 52.6 rushing yards per game and have only yielded 2 rushing touchdowns all year. Their 14.4 fantasy points per game allowed is 2 fewer points than the next closest defense. I don't think you should be sitting Mason unless you have a much better option, but I would have much lower expectations this week. And again, if you have better options, I am perfectly okay with sitting Jordan Mason in this matchup. Next up is Aaron Jones versus the Lions. The bye week couldn't come at a better time for Aaron Jones as he left their week 5 game with a hip injury. Last week, though, O'Connell said Aaron Jones was week to week. But good news is that Jones was already back to practice today. Now, they don't have to put out an official practice report until Wednesday, but still, it was good. It was a good sign to see Aaron Jones out there today at practice. Currently, Aaron Jones is averaging 17 touches per game and is the RB13 in fantasy points per game. Now, with all that being said, this is the best matchup. The Lions have been allowed the second fewest fantasy points to running backs this season, making Jones a less than optimal play. If he's going to get there, it's going to have to be through the air, but he has seen a 16% target share, which is the second highest rate in the league. So while this isn't a great matchup for Aaron Jones on the ground, I do think if they could get him involved in the passing game, I do think he can still get there in PPR formats. And then lastly, I just want to hit on the Bucs situation right now. Well, Sean Tucker and Bucky Irvin both had really solid performances last week, but with the likelihood of Rachaad White returning this week, this situation became an absolute mess. Todd Bowles spoke on Monday and said this could be a 3-man backfield, making none of these guys desirable starts on a week-to-week, and especially against the Ravens defense that has allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs this season. So at this point, until we see how things shake out, I am perfectly okay with sitting Rachaad White, Bucky Irving, as well as Sean Tucker, even if Rachaad White isn't going to come back, because this just isn't a great matchup. So that being said, let me know in the comment section below, what are your thoughts? Do you have any questions? If you have any start sit questions, we'll be happy to get to them. We will see you on the next one. Bye.